It's not getting off that easy because he's getting the microphone. Harry is our moderator, and Harry is crucial. He's the keystone in setting this event up for you today. So, Simeone Museum and Fred, we thank you very much, Harry, as well as our panelists, of course. That's Fred. Thank you, Harry. So I'm not going to tie you up because I'm not on the story. Harry is going to get us moving in the world of 4GT and the birth of the 4GT. So Harry will give our introductions and thanks. But our thanks to you, Harry.
I guess you could see through her camera. If I'm blocking you, tell me.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll let you know.
Thank you.
On your way.
Well, thank you all. God, this is fabulous. Look at this crowd. I want all of you to give yourselves a hand. This is the biggest crowd I think we've ever had for an event of this kind. We'll be introducing our panelists pretty soon, but let's give them a hand as well because they're all doing the time and expenses to come in here to the museum. I want to also, in addition to welcoming everybody here, this event is being live streamed, and that's because of William. Bill? Where's Bill?
There we go.
William Murphy and his crew is handling all of that, so this is being live streamed all over the world. Now, obviously there's one person missing today, and that's Dr. Simeone. He's having some mobility issues. And unfortunately can't come, but he did, do this little video to, thank you all for coming. So, William, when you're ready. We don't have a video, but I would like, because we think he is listening to this on the live stream. Next Wednesday is Fred's 87th birthday. I'm not supposed to say the date. I know, I'm in trouble. And it's also Olga. Where's Olga? Kevin's wife? Right in the back. It's Olga's birthday today, and she let Kevin come. I'd like to sing both of them happy birthday. Okay? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear friend Olga. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Fred. Now, a real quick thanks. I mentioned William, Kevin, but a lot of people are running around here with Simeone shirts on. They're both staff and volunteers, and that's what keeps this place alive. So a quick thank you to all the people that run this facility. Now, today's presentation is going to be on probably one of the most iconic race cars of all time, the Ford GT. And there's been a lot of stories about the origins of it, the Lola we have here, Eric Broadley, Roy Lunn, all of that. And one of the things we're going to try and do today is put a little focus on that. There are questions that will never be answered, but we have a distinguished group of experts here that will help to lend some background to it. The Lola, a lot of people feel is the originator, and I want to call out Kim Nelson. Where's Kim? Kim, stand up real quick. Kim and Chris Nelson both were responsible for bringing that car here to the museum, and thank you very much for all of your help. We have, a car. I've never seen a Mark I Ford GT before, especially not one this nice. And this came as a result of Benjamin Levy. Benjamin, would you please stand up? And Amy Thomas. Thank you, Benjamin and Ann, for bringing this gorgeous car. By the way, in the spirit of the times, Benjamin trailered this car from Massachusetts on an open trailer. So you can imagine the people on the New Jersey Turnpike saw a real Ford GT, at least the ones that knew what that was. And then to round it out, we have the two Fords from the museum, the Mark II and the Mark IV, that we'll also address here. We're going to talk about an hour or so here, and then you'll be able to see on the screen in back of us, we'll have live video as Alan and Mike walk around the cars and kind of point out some details of the construction. So for those of you, who can't see, you will be able to see it on the screen. We'll do a Q&A at the end of the session. But you do have to write the questions. If you have not written your questions and you have one, there are forms in the back of the room you have to fill out, and then I'll read the questions. We're going to do a demo at the end, and the first cars we'll take out will be the new cars in the back, so please remain seated. We'll have a video on the back screen here to keep you entertained. Remain seated as we move the cars out back. And speaking of the new cars, I would like to call out David Winter. David, where are you? Stand up, David. David has the 2005 Ford GT. And then Bob and Rob Ida. Bob and Rob, where are you guys? Stand up. I'm sorry you're in the back there. They brought 3 cars, a 2005, a 17, and an 18. Thank you very much for that. If you haven't already, we've got posters, t-shirts, etc. We'll have a table out back where you can get the participants to sign the poster. Alan Grant has got a book that has just now been released on his car. We only have a sample copy at this point, but Kim will be out back with order form. You can actually order it and have Alan will sign it, and then they'll mail it to you when it's done. Now, I'd like to point out another addition here. It's kind of over there in the corner. You see the red toolbox? Well, that was brought down by Natalie. Will you stand up? Where are you? Come on. Natalie gets recognition. And Teo, you stand up too. Now, come on, could you help? This is Mike Chesky's wife and son. And they loved that toolbox. That toolbox belonged to Phil Henney, and Phil was a fabricator for Shelby American and was one of the crew members on Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt's Mark IV that won Le Mans in 1967, and that was the toolbox he used and the tools he used. And they have donated that now to the Simeone.
Oh, wow.
So, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Phil. Next Saturday, we will continue this theme. Kevin mentioned the Americans at Le Mans Demo Day, but we will have an event at 11:30 before the Demo Day. We'll have Camilo Pardo here, and Camilo was the designer of the 2005 Ford GT. And the car that he used as his inspiration that was in his design studio is this very car, 1030. And it will be here along with a 2005, and Camilo will walk around and talk about how he came to his design of the new Ford GT. And then along with that, of course, the Americans at Le Mans Demo Day. So we have a very, very distinguished group of people here. And again, I want to thank you all for coming. And let me just read, let me put my glasses on here so I can do this. Let me read some brief bios. Alan Grant is right here next to me. Alan Grant has led a truly fascinating life with his passion for cars. He was a member of the 1965 World Championship Shelby American Cobra team, driving a Daytona Cobra Coupe, just like the one 2287 over here at the Simeone Museum. And he drove that both in the US and in Europe. And while he was in England, he was able to acquire this, which is the prototype Lola GT that we have here on display. But you may not know that Alan also inspired one of the main characters in an iconic Hollywood movie. Alan is a friend of Star Wars director George Lucas, who was a Shelby Gopher and a crew member for Alan when he was racing a Cobra. Lucas later based John Milner from his smash hit American Graffiti on his longtime pal and fearless driving style. So, great footnote. Mike Teskey is here in the white shirt. Mike's day job is almost as interesting as his role in the world of Ford GTs. He's been involved for 45 years in the design, development, and operation of 4 theme and 2 water parks located on the Walt Disney World Florida property, as well as Disneyland Paris, Walt Disney Studios Park Europe, Universal Studios Florida, Universal Islands of Adventure, Hard Rock Park, and Dolly World in Tennessee. He was also involved at a very early stage in the creation of this museum, advising Dr. Simeone about what he knew about making interesting and entertaining displays. But we know him for making 7 amazingly accurate continuation Mark IVs, which were serial numbers J13 through J19. In addition, Mike is a noted authority on Ford racing and was co-author of the book Ford Racing Century, and a contributor to several other books. His archives include much of the Ford corporate records from this era that Mike was able to save from being thrown away. And then at the end here is Janos Wimpren, and I've known Janos from when I did my very first book. Janos helped provide the appendix material in the back to that. And Janos was born in Austria, but was raised in Chicago. And like most kids in the 60s, he grew up following baseball and that almost unique form of fan participation, baseball statistics. He points at 1966 and the ABC sports coverage of Ford's victory at Le Mans as a turning point in his life. His fascination with sporting statistics spilled over into racing, but to his amazement, racing had almost nobody who cared about collecting numbers, facts, and dates in the same way that baseball had. And this led to his classic 2-volume set, Time and Two Seats, an era by era, year by year, race by race narrative of sports car and grand touring races between 1953 and 1998. Not only does each race have a lengthy and detailed narrative of what happened, Janos also assembled a complete list of the hundreds of entrants from events like the Mille Miglia and the results from obscure sports car races from the 50s and early 60s. Janos followed this monumental achievement by publishing a 4-volume photographic supplement, which I'm proud to say has some of my photos in it. He's published several other books as well as numerous print and online articles, including coverage of current sports car racing. All of this is a second career for Janos, having been involved for decades in academic and consulting endeavors covering geography and transportation. So thank you all. What a great group of people. And with ending here with Janos, I'm going to let you take the lead and kind of lay the groundwork for us on Ford's involvement in endurance racing.
Right. Thank you, Harry, and thank you all for being here. I'm certainly not as Harry has mentioned in the introduction, I'm not a Ford savant at all in the way that Mike and Alan are. I'm more of a generalist historian when it comes to sports car racing. So I'd kind of like to set the context of how we got to these 4 beautiful cars, going back maybe, well, not a whole century, but going back a few years prior, and lay the groundwork a little bit. I like to, when I think about motor racing history, I like to think of it in terms of a series of tensions, that you create a tension and you resolve that tension, not unlike a piece of music, a film, any work of art. It's all based on a challenge or a tension and then resolving that. And motor racing throughout its history has been that case. And we're seeing here one of the resolutions of that tension. And I guess one way of going back, if you go back to the beginning of time, there was that tension about what is the difference between a road car and a race car? And that was more or less resolved by about, I'll say the teens or the 20s, by things like the Indianapolis 500. Those were definitely not road cars anymore. But in very, very early days, there wasn't much difference between the two. Then there was another tension that came on, which is, well, when you're talking about cars that do race, there's still going to be some cars that represent cars that are on the road and others that do not. And thus was the birth of what we now kind of call the sports car. And that's one of these terms that's always kind of nebulous. What really does a sports car mean? But that issue kind of started to get resolved in the 20s and into the 30s, particularly with the institution of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It was the be-all and end-all of racing initially for cars that were labeled touring cars. They were meant to be the same cars you drove on the road that are now racing. And the important part about that kind of racing, they were endurance races. They weren't short, they were meant to be long. And of course, the 24 Hour of Le Mans is the longest of its kind and is with us to this day. In fact, 1 week from today will be this year's edition. And so that became sort of the next kind of resolution. We had now an establishment of what came to be called, weren't initially, but came to be called sports cars. Flash forward a few more decades, of course we had World War II, and out of the ashes of World War II came a couple of distinct racing series. One was Formula One, the World Driving and World Constructors Championship, purely for race cars. And the other, which began in 1953, was for sports cars. The world was initially called the World Sports Car Championship, went through a number of name changes over the decades. But already by that point, we had some establishment of what a sports car was. The earliest was things like this Bentley, one of the early winners of one of the early editions of Le Mans. It shows a little bit how that race became so iconic. Bentley has forever been associated with Le Mans as a result of their early victories there.
There we go.
Anyway, now in the 50s, we had another kind of tension emerging, which is the idea of what constitutes a racing sports car versus something that's less than a racing sports car. And this was kind of one of the early answers to that, the idea of a GT. And I bring this up because these are all labeled as GTs, but what really is a GT? What does that term mean? Technically it means Grand Touring, or Grand Touring in Italian, as it was originally labeled. And it was actually Lancia that first came up with this idea of having a car which you could drive to the opera on Saturday night and to the racetrack on Sunday morning. And this became kind of a separate division then within endurance racing, the race for GTs. And it also highlights another aspect about endurance racing, sports car racing, whatever you want to call it, that sets it up as different than, say, Formula One racing, which is just complex. There are multiple classes, multiple winners within a single race. You don't have that in Formula One. It's also one of the reasons I got really interested in it. Now, as the 50s developed, you had kind of two different strains, as you were, of racing. You had, on the one hand, still the cars built for these long-distance races. They tended to be the Ferraris, the Porsches. At various points in the 50s, there were makes dominant such as Jaguar, Mercedes, Maserati, and most importantly of all, Ferrari. Ferrari became iconic in that regard. Porsche, a little less so at that time, but both Porsche and Ferrari dealt with the problems of racing in different ways. Because one of the things that the 50s demonstrated to everybody is that you win races not by going the fastest, but by having the fastest laps. And that's a big difference. Because one of the things about going for speed in terms of brute force is that after a while you're going to hit a wall. The wall is called the atmosphere. And there's only so much you can do with displacement, horsepower, and all that. And these are kind of problems that began to emerge in racing in the 50s. How do you deal with this wall called the atmosphere? Also, how do you deal with issues that some of these early cars were quite heavy? Some of the cars were quite heavy, but the braking was difficult. At the end of the lap, at the end of the straightaway, you had to stop. Jaguar was one of the innovators there with disc brakes to be able to stop the cars. So you started to slowly have these innovations that coalesced during the 50s. In terms of aerodynamics, in terms of engine efficiency, Porsche was very good at engine efficiency, that they were able to get a lot of bang for the buck out of fairly small engines, and also began to streamline their cars more and more. One of the things about aerodynamics at this point, too, is that aerodynamics could be your enemy if you're just trying to run into the air with brute force. The air is your enemy. You can kind of coexist with the air if you're streamlining, or, as you see in the cars here, when you begin to develop wings, airfoils, things of that sort, you're making the atmosphere your friend. And so by the turn of the 60s, you began to see the atmosphere being partly as your friend. Another kind of theme that was going on at this time was that there were both tinkerers and major players at the same time. Tinkerers, you have people like the Allard, which is an example of around the corner. And the Allard was a case of
Jaguar.
taking one chassis and putting in another engine, which is very much an American idea of the hot rodding. Well, it's not that.
The march backwards. There we go. No?
Anyway, that the Allard was a case of tinkerers, where you had tinkerers working with the cars. You had a chassis of one manufacturer, Allard. In the case of the Allard, you put in a big, huge American V8, a Cadillac in the case of the one that's here. Others had other engines. So you have these, which is very much an American sense of being a hot rodder of one kind or another. So you had those kinds of solutions to some of these problems. You had the kind of still middle-sized manufacturers such as Porsche and Ferrari. And here's an interesting thing that we tend to forget. We tend to think of Porsche and Ferrari as these incredibly iconic marques, which they've become. But in the 50s, they were kind of sketchy operations. Both, for example, had to export to the United States to survive. Both were at various times kind of not quite clear whether they were going to make it or not. In fact, that's one of the reasons that Ford thought he had a great avenue to buying Ferrari. Well, these people aren't going to make it on their own, so I'm going to come in there with my big bucks and take it over. So you have this battle, in effect, between artisans on the one hand and the big manufacturers on the other. And artisans very often make much better race cars than big corporations do. Artisans don't make very good road cars, but they do make good race cars. There's a lot of know-how that goes into that. And that, again, began to kind of come out of this period in the 60s. So, or in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, what also happened at that point is, of course, Ferrari became the dominant in the World Sports Car Championship. They won Le Mans with the Testarossa alone in 58, 1960, 1961, then moved on to the P series of cars in later years, increasingly successful. In fact, they won all the way through into 1965. And since 1965, Ferrari has won 0. They have not won Le Mans since 1965, which goes to show a little bit of what this meant to them, what the Ford initiative did with Ferrari at that point, is that it really shut them down in many, many, many ways. You had kind of a seminal turning over at this point. Remember that I talked about artisans and their role. And that's something that Ford, of course, recognized, that in order to win, just working with the boardroom and working with the in-house designers wasn't going to quite cut it. He had to go out and look for something else, and thus took on the services of people like Carroll Shelby, took on the work of people like Eric Broadley, who designed this Lola over here, and adopted those into the Ford framework. And that's very much shifted the ethos is at work. One of the things, of course, Ford also learned another lesson in this, and that lesson is that to win Le Mans, you first have to lose Le Mans. Everyone has always learned that lesson. It's a kind of a John Wyer, who was famously a team manager for first Aston Martin, the Porsche, that said that it takes 3 years, and Tom Walkinshaw later on, who was the Jaguar team manager, said pretty much the same thing. First year is very much character building. You're going to lose. The second year, you're going to still make mistakes, but you're going to get better. The third year, you're open to win. And that's exactly where Ford was. It took them 3 years to get there, but then they dominated. And then we'll talk a little bit too about the story of what happened after that domination was complete. So I think with that, we'll just move over to...
Okay, we'll turn it over now to Mike. Mike, if you would kind of give us a little bit of a background about Ford, where they were, in terms of a corporation, and how and why they got into racing.
Okay, so unlike Janos, I'll probably get up and look at different things, but I'll start out by saying that in the 50s, Ford, the Congress was getting upset about accidents. More cars were on the road, and people were getting more high-performance cars, and deaths were going up. So the AMA agreement was, we're not going to do any racing, and everybody put their pencils down and let it go for 5 years. And then Ford realized that the people that were still racing were getting all the publicity, and the win on Sunday and sell on Monday wasn't really happening for them. So in '62, in April, Ford said, we're getting out of the AMA agreement, it's just not working. And that summer, they contracted with Carroll Shelby to do the Cobra. And that summer of '62, we'll get into something that they wanted to do for the automobile show in the fall of '62. So next slide. So the Mustang won. You're jumping way ahead. So you can go back to the next one. So the Mustang won was the first venture, other than paying Carroll Shelby to race the Cobras. They internally went into building the Mustang One. If you go to the next slide, it was put together by two executives. There's Herb Misch and Gene Bordenat. They started the project, and it was a styling exercise. They wanted to add a little spice to the auto show, and so they contacted Roy Lunn and his team. And they created the Mustang One. If you go to the next slide. It was shown at the Watkins Glen in September or October, and there was a lot of interest with that car. They knew that the baby boomers were coming of age to where they were going to buy cars, and they were trying to appeal to these people and change Ford's image of a Falcon as what they built. And so this is the summary of the SAE paper. They say sports cars by their nature are by their nature controversial. They arouse the interest of the adolescent and of those reaching a second childhood. Anybody here relate to that? They excite the otherwise calm and accentuate the egotistical. Anybody here like that? They are admired by many and purchased by a comparatively few. And I think that's a great summary of what the sports car arena is all about. So after the show, Lee Iacocca had taken over from McNamara, and he was trying to make an impression to the world through the products that Ford were going to build. And he wanted to get some excitement into Ford. And so they, if you go back, I want to Basically, this is all internal documents that I got from Ford or from Roy Lund. These are excerpts from them. Basically, they said, we have too big of a company. We can't do things quickly. So they said, let's pursue buying another company to do styling and another company to do prototypes and small production runs. And so they internally said, we should go after Ghia and Ferrari. And so this was in April of '63. If you go to the next one. So they went after them. On April 22nd, they went over to Ghia on Monday and Ghia on Tuesday for negotiating their purchase. And then on Wednesday and Thursday, they went and said, we'd like to talk to you about buying a Ferrari. Next one. So their summary on the 15th, or the 5th, they said, the main reasons for the proposed purchase of Ferrari are to develop the capability of producing one-of-a-kind new concept cars and show cars, both quickly and inexpensively, compared to what they do at Detroit. They have a facility for producing limited volume special model lines with relatively low initial investment, and to gain quickly a background in operational program in international racing, particularly in the GT class, and to use the name in advertising. So, next slide. So the paper that's blue, those were for the executives. Those would go to Patterson and Henry Ford and Iacocca. And so this was the summary. They had worked it out. Ferrari originally wanted $18 million, and they negotiated it down to $10 million. You imagine that? You can buy one of those Ferraris for that amount. So, next slide. So the word got out, the press had heard about it, and internally they were working on their press release. That's what's on the right-hand side. Then the next slide. But if you just notice the dates, it was just a few days later, the deal was off. And I was talking to Roy Lund, and he said that when they were negotiating the final terms, they had a bunch of lawyers in there, and Ford made the mistake of just having too many people there. And so the accountants were saying, we're going to have Ford Ferrari on this side and Ferrari Ford on this side. Well, who pays for cleaning the restrooms in the middle? And that's the moment that Ferrari got up and went into his office, and Fry went back, and then they had the conversation about, if I want to race at Indianapolis, am I allowed to? And he said no. So anyway, that ended the deal. I want to go back to one quote here on that last one. Roy Lund, he said, obviously Enzo Ferrari was the lead guy in the business. He had been winning the race for years. I never did like the idea, and I certainly said so at the time. You know, if we buy him and he continues to win, it's going to be Ferrari. But if it won't be Ford, it'll be Ferrari. If we buy him and he loses, it's going to be all Ford's fault. So on the way back from Italy, Don Fry and Roy Lund were in the plane together, and they said, well, what are we going to do? So the next day, Iacocca wants that you put together a presentation on what you're going to do about the fact that the Ferrari deal fell apart. So the timing here is incredibly condensed. So if you notice the dates, this is May 23rd. By May 31st, he has to have a presentation. In the next slide. So they presented on May 31st that they were going to have the Cobra 2, and it consists of two versions. One would be a GT prototype that would be just for racing, and then they would have another one for the street. And so out of that meeting, the decision was to proceed, was quick, and the rest of the meeting was talking about what are they going to do when they won. So they're just naive about what it takes. So he was given a whole amount of $93,000 to build the GTs.
Jeez.
And $235,000. And then Roy was off to the races. Do the next slide. So the next slide. So June 13th to the 25th was a plan to go visit Le Mans and then visit a few manufacturers. They were going to look at Cooper, Lotus, and Lola. And it's important to understand that prior to this trip, first of all, Ford was a huge company. I think they had 300,000 employees. So there were some people that were working with Shelby and Dave Evans and Passano and all that. But they were a completely separate division than the guys that were doing the Mustang One and all that. So they really didn't know what was going on in each other's camp. But to get ready for the design, to go over and interview people, they wanted to have a package and say, kind of like a scope document, we want you to build this. And so they put together a package of what they believed the car should look like. And you go to the next slide. So this is the issue 1. This is Roy Lund's copy. You can see the corrections that he did. It talks about the design of the car. You go to the next slide. And he started with what he had just done. He started with the Mustang One. So what's a mid-engine car? If you describe a mid-engine car, any car that's mid-engine here, you describe it, it'll be the same, basically. The information that was acquired from the Mustang One study was a starting point for the original Mark I GT40. And so here you can see the drawings of the proposed GT and the Mustang One. And so you can see many similarities, especially like in the headlights. The adjustable pedals, and of course the 289. And they had originally planned on having a canopy. If you go to the next slide, the bits, go back one. The bits are the Mustang One suspension, the Mustang One rear suspension, the Indy motor, and the Indy Lotus Collide. That's the only exposure they had because they really didn't know about Lola, what they were doing with it. So the next slide shows the concept, and there's a series of concepts here. They went from clay, look at the dates, June 11th, and then the 19th. So they very quickly went through a series of effort to put together a package to go.
Mike, this was at a time before they had even met with Eric Brothers.
This is all before they met with Lola. This was, they were going over and saying, we want you to build this, Cooper. Colin Chapman, we want you to build this. And then Eric Broadley, we want you to build this. And so this is the sports car version, not the race car version. And the next slide. And fast forward, in February of '64, they had a model of the GT46. And by the way, Harry, isn't there something coming out in print soon?
Yes, we've got an article coming out that Mike and I wrote together called Whatever Happened to Roy Lund's Other Ford GT, the GT46, which was the road version that Roy really wanted. And it's going to appear in Wayne Carini's magazine, The Chase. It should be out. In fact, you just reminded me, it may actually be in my mailbox. Sorry, I forgot to look.
To your mailbox soon? And then I think the next slide we go into after the trip. This is a very interesting comment, I think, if you read it. Of the companies considered, it is recommended that Lola is the #1 choice for the following reasons. They could adopt the Lola formula, Lola Ford as a development base for the proposed Ford vehicle. And Broadley is recognized as an excellent designer with extensive Formula One experience. The Lola identity is limited. The product would be Ford. In other words, and that was what Colin Chapman, the negative about Colin was is that they felt like Colin would try to put him in front of Ford and make it a Lotus version. And then against its limited resources, people and facilities, and no production facilities, and this is Roy Lund's comment, Broadly may be difficult to work with. So So anyway, the next slide, this is where they're off to England. They set up camp. 4 people went over. It was Roy Lund, Chuck Mountain, Ron Martin, and Len Bailey. And they set up shop and they started to design the car.
And those are the Lola GTs, right?
Those are the Lola GTs on the left. And with that, I think we turn it over to Alan to take it from there.